An argument. The idea, it starts from the premise that Muslims don't accept democracy, which is ludicrous across Europe. And it also starts from the premise that Muslims are somehow a problem for the great European continent. Do you know what the Muslim population of Europe is? 5%. Are you saying that 5% of the population pose a threat to everyone? And as for democracy, I'm sorry, but I can't take lessons from the far right in democracy. The history of Europe, European democracy, has been blighted by far right parties from Germany to Italy to Spain.
Morton, your turn coming in. I was quoting you there, but your response now to what Mary's been saying.
Well, I think it's a shame that we don't agree that regardless of how and where, then people who don't acknowledge and don't embrace the rule of law, the democracy, equality of the sexes, and the freedom of speech, and all these matters that we define as the very fundamental values of our civilization, that those simply don't belong in Europe. There are plenty of alternative countries if they want to live in Iran or other places where they can have it their way. I think we need to make it very clear that people are welcome in Europe, but they can, the immigrants who are coming, I think they're very welcome in Europe, but we cannot question the fundamental values of our civilization, which is democracy. So if you want to live in a, well, we have. I'm aware. I guess that you must be aware of what's going on in other countries than in Britain, especially listening to your condemnation of my party. In Denmark, for instance, we have had demonstrations here against the very fundamental principle of somebody using their right to freedom of speech. We have people here advocating against rule of law, advocating in favor of Sharia, in favor of violence, against democracy. These people simply don't belong in Europe. There are plenty of other countries where they could have a life just their way, but we must just remain on our road, which is a road of freedom and democracy.
But David, why are we accepting? I'm not accepting the terms that are set on this debate by the far right. I don't accept that there's a huge number of people who want Sharia law. But let's look at Britain. British Muslims, 1.8 British Muslims. Gallup polling shows that British Muslims are more likely to identify with the UK than non-Muslim Britons. They are more likely to want to live in mixed areas than segregated areas than non-Muslim Britons. There is this myth being peddled by the alarmists on the far right across Europe that Muslims are taking over the continent and creating Sharia law and they're coming to get you. It's the same language that was used about minorities in the past. It was the same language used about Jews in the 1920s and 30s. Every minority community goes through this demonization and scaremongering. Instead of dealing with the financial and economic problems across this continent caused by the banks, caused by deregulation, it's much easier for far-right parties like the Danish People's Party to say it's all the fault of these immigrants, it's all the fault of these minorities who want to wear the burqa. Do you know how many people wear the burqa in France, David? 2,000 women out of 2 million French Muslim women. So this is the kind of scaremongering and alarmism that is created by parties like the Danish People's Party. Morton says I don't live in Denmark. I don't. But I do know, for example, that the United Nations condemned the Danish People's Party for referring to for comparing the Somali community in Denmark to paedophiles. So this is not just about religion. This is not just about integration. This is about electioneering. This is about alarmism. This is about the typical tactics of the far right when it comes to any minority community. It just happens to be the Muslims these days.
Back to you, Morton. I mean, are you creating a monster that doesn't exist?
I think it's a shame to listen to your to the professor in your studio that is trying to speak this problem down or to minimize it. First of all, I'm not a far-right politician. Secondly, this is not an issue which is only being dealt with by so-called far-right organizations. We have Angela Merkel, we have Sarkozy, we have Cameron, we even have socialist movements from out in at least my country and other countries in Europe who are actually talking openly about this as a problem. It is not to say that just because you are Muslim, you are a problem. Of course not. I have many Muslim friends, many people who come from other countries who should be welcome, who have integrated. That's not the issue here. The issue here is that those among the Muslim populations who wish to abolish democracy, who are in favor of Sharia and all these matters, these we simply have to face and say, you are in your perfect only right to have these opinions, but they do not belong in Europe. We do have to
You've described Muslims in general.
You don't even know me. How can you be so insinuating?
You've described Muslims in general as a burden on Europe, have you not? In an interview with Front Page magazine, you described Muslims as a burden on Europe. Not Islamists, not extremists. You described Muslims, all 20 million of us in this continent, as a burden.
Back to you,
what
Morten.
I'm stressing here is that we have been in Europe for centuries. We have been welcoming migrants here. We have Jews here who are, by the way, now forced to flee the country due to Islamists who are harassing them. We have welcomed Chinese people, Indians, people from all over the world, and that has not forced any problems. None of these have told the Danish society that it needed to be changed. Now suddenly we are faced with a new minority group that are telling us that we need to change our way of life, that we need to change our society, that women shall not have equal rights with men, that we shall not be able to speak as freely as we used to, that democracy is not as good as a way of life as Sharia law. This is an entirely new situation which we have not seen earlier on with other migration groups. You cannot just simply close your eyes and say that this is only the far right talking about this. This is the reality. The average population of Europe is actually realizing these changes of their society, and obviously people are reacting as are Sarkozy, Merkel, and any other sane politician in Europe.
You talk about freedom of speech. I'm in favour of freedom of speech, as are most people. What they're not in favour of, they're not in favour of hate speech, they're not in favour of defamation. For example, in December, David, a member of Morten's party was prosecuted in Denmark for referring to Muslims as people who rape their children. He was prosecuted in a court of law in Denmark. So when Morten comes here and says, I believe in freedom of speech, of course he just believes in freedom of speech. But it's not the kind of speech most Europeans want to listen to. And I think it doesn't help integration. If Morten and people like Morten care about integration, then we should actually be finding what we have in common. We shouldn't be scaremongering. We shouldn't be hysterical. We should actually recognise, as Morten says, that Europe's been welcoming groups for centuries, for decades. Europe is a multicultural continent. So why throw the baby out with the bathwater? If there are a few extremists, if there are people who have extreme views, who have violent attitudes, let's deal with them. Let's not generalise and pretend all 20 million Muslims in Europe, 5% of the population, are either A, extreme, or B, on the verge of taking over the continent. And let's not just discriminate on one particular group. Morten gets very upset, for example, about halal meat in Denmark, but I don't see him getting upset about kosher meat. We allow Jewish communities to kill animals in a kosher way as part of their cultural religious practices. But if Muslims do it, it's the end of the world. Europe's coming to an end. This is a kind of crazy rhetoric we hear from the far right and the Danish People's Party.
Crazy rhetoric and such phrases. Are you thinking of a situation which is getting worse or better?
It's a good sign that more and more politicians are now beginning to address this problem, are beginning to stress it very clearly that we don't want to compromise our fundamental values. I think that's a very good sign, because that's the first step in order to change our migration laws so that we only attract those who are actually of a integrational potential, those who will feel welcome and therefore be welcomed by the European countries.
I'm already here.
We need to have a much more updated.
Carry on.
And you're welcome. I mean, I would never use the same language against you, sir, as you have used against me, because
That's
I simply
not true.
don't know you.
Your party referred to Somalis as paedophiles and were condemned by the United Nations Committee on the Elimination of Racism last summer, were they not? The Danish People's Party was condemned by the United Nations Committee on the Elimination of Racism for referring to Somalis as paedophiles.
It's simply not.
That never happened.
True. I mean,
am I making that up?
Speak about throwing lies around and generalizing.